Good, so that's the basic format. Now, I should also emphasize that this session was advertised as being advanced tools, techniques, and program evaluation, and it's in the advanced stream. So I'm taking that fairly seriously. I want this to be something that will be sort of building on existing knowledge and sort of being something that can provide some extra substance for people who are somewhat familiar with these ideas already. So I'm assuming that people basically know what this means. I mean, I'll explain it very briefly, but if this is very foreign to you, you probably won't, this is probably not the session for you. So now's the time to leave with no shame. But that's not to scare anyone, because I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Okay, good. So only one person left, so hopefully a good start. Did anyone go to my session yesterday, by the way? It's okay if you did, so a few people, mostly not, that's also fine. Okay, so let me get started. So I'm going to talk about tools and techniques of program evaluation. So the basic idea that I'm addressing is, how do we know what works? So, we're effective altruists, we want to be able to donate to effective causes. To do that, we have to know what causes are effective. Empirical evidence, particularly based on sort of statistical analysis, is a very common way of determining what works. It's not the only way, but it's an important way. It's particularly useful for anything related to global poverty. I'd say animal activism as well. Less relevant for far future sort of causes, though not irrelevant there either. So the general sort of focus is going to be on sort of global poverty development stuff, but the tools are more widely applicable than that. I'm just going to draw on examples from sort of global poverty and development side of things. So basically we're going to talk about how we work out what's effective using statistical evidence and inference, how common tools that are used and how they can go wrong, and some of the different strategies and methodologies that are applied. So the point here is not to turn you into researchers. Obviously I can't do that in 1 hour, and many of you are not going to be researchers anyway. The point is to introduce you and further expand your knowledge on some of these techniques so you can better critically analyze evidence that's presented to you and think through data and evidence that you're presented with. Okay, so that's the basic point of what we're doing. So let me then get started with the material. Okay, so we're starting with the idea of simple linear regression. So as I said, I'm assuming people basically know what this is, but the idea here, does this actually, it doesn't, never mind, I'll just click through it. The basic idea is we have our dependent variable y. In the example, did I actually use a running example here? I did not. That was yesterday's talk. So y is our dependent variable, x is our independent variable. So y is the thing we're trying to predict or trying to explain. X is the thing or things, you can have more than one, that we're using to try to explain our dependent variable. So the example that I used in the talk yesterday was our dependent variable is like household income, or individual income or something like that, and x could be education level, or it could be health status, or the region of the country that you live in, or gender, or anything else that you think might account for differences in your y, differences in income. Yes, and so we sort of plot that on a xy plot there, determine the relationship, fit the curve using ordinary least squares, determine our coefficients, beta 0 and beta 1. Beta 1 is the main one I'm interested in, that's the slope coefficient that tells you the relationship between x and y. We do that using least squares, which minimizes the sum of squared residuals of the relationship. So is this generally okay? I'm assuming that people have heard this before. Okay, good. So that's just a quick refresher, not a very good explanation. Okay, so the point where I really want to pick up here is that if our model is correctly specified and we don't have endogeneity, which I'll explain in a minute, but if certain assumptions are satisfied, then ordinary least squares, minimizing the sum of squared residuals, will give unbiased estimates for the population parameters. So that's particularly beta 1 there, the main one we're interested in, the relationship between our x and y variables. So OLS gives us unbiased estimates. Yay, which is good, we want unbiased estimates. But that relies on certain assumptions, and this is where we're going to get into the sort of meat of it, because these assumptions are not always met, obviously. So I'm just going to talk briefly through these assumptions. These are the assumptions of the ordinary least squares regression. We're not going to go through all of them in detail. There are different ways you can sort of divide them up depending on exactly how you define them. This is a fairly standard way of doing it. So first, I should have revealed these sequentially, but never mind. So just look at the top one first. The model is linear and correctly specified. So that means we've written the equation correctly, y equals beta 0 plus beta 1 x1 and so on. So when is this violated? Well, it's violated if we've omitted any variables. So if we should have extra x variables there, extra independent variables that we haven't included in the equation but should really be there, then the model will be misspecified. Also, if we have non-linear relationships, so we've assumed a linear relationship here, if there's any non-linearity, the model will be misspecified. If if there's a simultaneous relationship, so x determines y, but y also determines x. So an example of that would be income determines, your education level determines your income, because more education leads to more income, but also the more income you have, the more education you can afford. So that it goes in sort of both directions. That's what I mean by a simultaneous equation or a simultaneous relationship. So if that happens, you'll also get a model misspecification. And that's bad, that leads to biased estimates. We'll come back to that idea. Second assumption, the conditional mean error is 0. That's an assumption, it's not super important, we're not going to focus on it. I'm just putting them up here for completeness. Third assumption, the errors are uncorrelated with each other and have a constant variance. So that's an important assumption. It basically means the errors here, that the difference between each point and the predicted line is sort of well, on average is constant across the regression. So you don't have what's called heteroscedasticity, where the errors are increasing or decreasing. That's an important assumption, but if it's violated, it doesn't lead to biased estimates. So we're not going to focus too much on that. Still can be a problem though. Assumption 4 here. This is another one we're going to focus on. The independent variables are fixed, that's pretty unusual, but more importantly are independent of the errors. So let me explain this one carefully. This, I wish I had a pointer here. So it's this here. I don't have a sticker. Sorry? That would make sense, wouldn't it? Yes. That's what I did yesterday. So this here, this is the critical thing here. So our x's are not correlated with our residuals here, or our errors. Yeah, so the value of the x doesn't tell you anything about what the error is likely to be. That's an absolutely critical assumption. And when that's violated, that's called endogeneity. So if you remember I mentioned that before, when this is false, we have endogeneity, and it's a huge problem. It leads to biased estimates. Okay, I'm going to not talk about this one, that's pretty unusual. So, to recap, these are the assumptions that ordinary least squares assumes. If all of these assumptions are met, then ordinary least squares, just doing your regular regression relationship, will give you unbiased estimates of the population parameters, which essentially means it'll give you the right answer on average. But if any of these assumptions are violated, we won't necessarily have that property. And the two ones that I want to focus on are this one and this one, because if these two are violated, we'll get biased estimates, which means on average we won't get the right answer, which is a problem, of course, because then we're going to make incorrect inferences about what programs are effective or what causes what. So the two main ones here are model misspecification and endogeneity. Those are the assumptions that we're sort of focusing on. Now I'm going to switch from focusing on the assumptions to talking about why those assumptions can be violated. So it's just important to understand what I'm doing here. I'm talking about the assumptions of OLS, ordinary least squares. Now I'm going to talk about why those assumptions can be violated. You'll note that there are some commonalities. So emitted variables can be a problem for assumption 4 and assumption 1. So I'm going to talk about 4 things, and this is critical because we need to know why our assumptions are violated if we're going to sort of try to fix the problems, right? Otherwise, how do we know what to do? So the main ones that I'm going to look at are emitted variables, misspecification, let's see, I've forgotten. Emitted variables, misspecification, simultaneity, and measurement error. So these are 4 of the main reasons why we can get assumptions 1 and 4 to fail, and therefore get biased estimates. Okay, yeah, so these are the 2 that I'm focusing on here. So let's talk about the reasons for why these violations can occur. So emitted variables, that's the first one I mentioned previously. So our estimates will be biased if we have emitted variables. So in other words, the true relationship looks like this. So y could be, let's take income as an example. Oh, yeah, they've got an example here. Earnings and education, but let's say that earnings also depends on tenure, so like the amount of time you've been at the company or something like that. But we just estimate y against education. We leave off tenure. So that would be an example. Estimating this equation when we should have estimated this one will lead to omitted variable bias. And this is it will lead to omitted variable bias as long as there's a correlation between the 2 variables. So if people who have more education tend to have longer tenure, then what this is saying, this is an expression for the expected value of, so this is our estimator. This is basically what OLS gives us. What this is saying is, on average, sort of in the long run, if we did this a lot of times, we would expect our estimator to give us this is the answer. This is what we want. We want beta 2. That's the population parameter we're trying to estimate. So ideally, we just want that. We don't want... The problem is this thing here. That's bias, right? So this is the right answer, and this is bias. You can see that the higher there's the correlation between x2 and x3, the larger the bias will be. So if the emitted variable is uncorrelated with any of the variables that are in your equation, then it won't prove a problem, but that's generally not going to happen very often. Generally, they will be correlated, in which case you'll get this term here, and on average, your estimate will give you a biased answer. So again, the true answer that you want plus this extra stuff. So that's a problem if we have emitted variables. We need to include all of the relevant variables in our equation if we're to get it right. The second problem that can lead to biased estimates is model misspecification. Our estimates will be biased if we specify the wrong interactions and functional form. So by some definitions, omitted variables is a form of misspecification. But here I'm specifically talking about the functional form and interaction terms. So this example that I've given here is just an idea of we're regressing like GDP growth against, a bunch of different variables. So this is trade and some measure of democracy in a country. Exactly what they are aren't super important. But the point is, maybe there's a linear relationship here, maybe there's a quadratic relationship on trade, or maybe there's an interaction term between trade and democracy. Plausibly, there could be. They could interact with each other. Maybe we should be looking at a logarithmic transformation of the interaction term. We could have quadratic terms for both of them, blah, blah, blah. You see all the possibilities here. It's not necessarily obvious which of these is the right model to specify. If we specify the wrong one, we'll get biased results on our parameters. So that's another problem. I'll skip that. Okay. A third reason that can lead to failure of those assumptions that we mentioned is simultaneity. So remember, the idea of simultaneity is when there's kind of like a loop of causation. So X causes Y and Y causes X. Now, maybe I could have left some of this off, but this here is showing us something very similar to what we saw here. And this we'll see repeatedly. I want to emphasize this because it's important to understand. In order to fix these problems, we need to understand where the bias is coming from. And then we can try and resolve it by doing something to sort of counteract that. So see, here's the bias. It comes from the correlation. This is emitted variables, right? It comes from the correlation between our emitted variable and our included variable. Let's look at this one. It's pretty much the same thing. Ignore this p-lim thing. This is basically the expected output of our estimator using OLS is equal to the right answer. That's what we want. Plus this stuff here. What's this? This is essentially the correlation or covariance between the error term and our this is our x variable. Oops, it's called w here, but that's our x. So basically, when there's simultaneity, what tends to happen is that our x variable will be correlated with the error term, and that leads to endogeneity. That's a violation of assumption 4. So that's a problem. Final thing, measurement error. So if when I'm running a regression, I've got my x variable and my y variable, well, at least those. I may have multiple x variables. When we looked at these assumptions, when we looked at these were assuming, especially assumption 4, assuming that we measure our x's accurately. We have an accurate, exact results for our measurements of whatever x is. So if it's, say, education, we have an exact, correct measurement of what everyone's education is. That's the assumption here. If that is not true, we get what's called measurement error. It turns out, for slightly non-intuitive reasons, you can have measurement error in y, and that's okay, but if it's in x, then that's a problem. Now, the basic idea is that if you have measurement error in x, so if we can't measure the x variables exactly, if there's some noise, which of course there always is in the real world, that leads to bias. So basically, this is a slightly different way of expressing it, but the observed slope will be equal to, so using OLS, using our traditional method, a slope that you get will be equal to the correct one multiplied by this factor here, which depends on the relative variance of the true x compared to the observed x. Now note that if there's a lot of noise in my observed x, this is going to be bigger than this, right? Because there's extra noise. I mean, you're going to have the true variation plus more noise. So this is going to be the variation in the true x plus extra noise due to measurement error, whereas this one is just the actual variation in x. So the point is, generally you're going to have this being bigger than this, and therefore this is less than 1. And therefore the observed slope shrinks. This is called attenuation bias. The basic idea is if you can't measure your x very well, your estimated parameters shrink. So you'll get a biased downward estimate of the effect. So that's a particular problem because it means that if you can't measure your independent variables properly, then you're going to systematically think that your programs aren't working, essentially, or your variables aren't significant. Anyways, okay, so let's jump back a little bit to summarize. So, least squares method that we know and love gives us unbiased estimates for our population parameters. Yay. But only if all of these assumptions are satisfied. Particularly if these two are satisfied. These are the critical ones for our purposes. If the model is correctly specified and if the x's are independent of the errors here. If those fail, it leads to biased estimates. How can those fail? Well, they can fail for a bunch of reasons, particularly if you leave variables out that should have been in there, if you misspecify your model, if there's simultaneous relationships, x causing y causing x, that you don't take into account properly, and if you mismeasure x's. All those things can lead to bias. Okay, so what do we do about this? Well, measurement error, simultaneous relationships, not knowing what model to specify, and not being able to include all your variables pretty much always happen. So that is potentially a negative result for regression analysis, right? So if in the real world our estimates are often going to be biased, well, what are we going to do about that? Is the technique useless? That's something that I want you to discuss. Well, not that it's useless, but what use it has given these limitations. But partly in reaction to these concerns that we kind of can't reproduce results reliably because it depends on what assumptions you're making, etc. There's an alternative approach. Is it alternative? Is it complementary? Again, that's another question. But as I'll show you, there's some debate in the literature about this. This is called the program evaluation approach. So instead of doing what we do in a linear regression where we try to add controlling variables and see what the relationship is between each variable and our dependent variable. So instead of doing that, we just try to let random variation do all the hard work for us. So basically, this is the approach of the randomized controlled trial. We'll come back to that. So randomized controlled trial isn't the only method in the program evaluation approach, but it's sort of seen as the gold standard. So the key point here is if you randomly select samples from your population and assign one to a treatment and one to a control condition, you can avoid, well, in theory, all of these problems. Emitted variables should not be relevant in this case because the two groups should be identical if you've selected them randomly. Because that's critical. So there should be no differences in other variables between them. So you shouldn't have to control for that. It's the same thing with model specification because you don't need to add controlling variables. You don't need to specify the form of the model. It's similar with, measurement error actually still is an issue with randomized controlled trials, interestingly, but we'll maybe leave that off. Simultaneity also shouldn't be an issue because, again, you are intervening causally. So you can sort of break that loop of x causing y, y causing x, where you just sort of increment one variable by a bit and say, what's the effect on the other one? So the basic idea is that performing randomized controlled trials allows you to avoid these assumptions of either satisfy them or kind of make them irrelevant of OLS, of ordinary least squares. And this is why people argue that, so if it's done properly, there can't be hidden confounds. You kind of avoid these problems. This is why its advocates argue that this is a really good technique. We should be using this way more because we can avoid these problems that ordinary least squares that regression is subject to. I might come back to that, actually, because I want to talk about that. But, but is it a gold standard? Is it all it's cracked up to be? That's a question I want to raise. Because there are people who have criticised the use of the program evaluation method, especially randomized controlled trials in the econometrics literature. So there are some people who are really in favour of it. Esther Duflo has written a lot on this and really sort of championed the use of RCTs in development studies. Lancet, sort of outswinging with the idea that the World Bank is finally embracing science. I'm not sure what they were doing all those decades before, apparently not science. But there are people who are arguing back. Are RCTs really the gold standard? The elusive keys to economic development in this article is maybe not so obvious from the title, but he's saying that he doesn't like RCTs that much, or he thinks they're overblown at least. So what do these people say who are criticising the program evaluation approach, and RCTs in particular? What are their arguments? Well, obviously, RCTs are expensive and time-consuming and that you can't do them everywhere. Everyone kind of knows that. But there are further criticisms as well. One of the criticisms of randomized controlled trials is that they ignore or cannot really incorporate general equilibrium effects. So what does this mean, a general equilibrium? Well, the basic idea in economics is that general equilibrium refers to what happens when you sort of consider all of the flow-on effects of an intervention or something that changes. So this diagram is not really perfect, but it maybe illustrates it. So if I do something that is small, it's not going to have much of an effect on the rest of the economy. So say if I go to one village and give people some money, that's not really going to have much of an effect on the rest of the economy. So I can just assume that I can give people money in that village, like Give Directly does when they give unconditional cash transfers, and I can assume everything else is going to stay the same because I haven't changed very much in the whole system, like in the country as a whole and the economy as a whole. That's called a partial equilibrium analysis. You just assume everything else is the same and don't sort of consider any flow-on effects. Of course, it's much easier to do that because the alternative is to say, well, what happens as a result of this change in the income of the village? Well, these people in this village spend money in other villages, which increases their income, and that increases demand for their goods and services, which then, changes prices here and on and on and on. And there's all these interactions and flow-on effects. That's the general equilibrium analysis. Conducting a general equilibrium analysis of the effects of a policy is very, very, very hard. So we generally like to avoid doing that. And particularly, randomized controlled trials can't really do it, largely because they're almost always quite small. And so there won't be much of a general equilibrium effect. You're not really going to see it. When the program is scaled up, like for example, we might give unconditional cash grants to a few people in different villages. It seems effective, so we start giving them to everyone or a large fraction of the people in the country. The point is there might be different effects because of general equilibrium effects. If that's unclear, an example that I've given before is the idea of suppose this is a slightly silly example, but it illustrates the idea. Suppose we were to conduct a randomized controlled trial where we just gave a random subset of people university degrees. Not like fake ones, but like real ones, but without them having to actually do anything. So then they could go and get employment, with these. And presumably they wouldn't be as good as someone who actually, completed the coursework, but, they would still have a prestigious qualification. So I would imagine that the people we gave these degrees to would do better in the employment-wise than the control group whom we didn't give these to. But then, if we looked at that study and said, hey, look, we gave these people degrees that they didn't earn, and they did better in the workforce, let's give degrees to everyone, and everyone will do better. Right? No, obviously that's not going to work because the only reason that they were doing better was because they're sort of providing a signal to employers that they're better than other people. But if everyone had a sort of degree that they didn't earn, then that signal would be useless, right? So that's a general equilibrium effect. You don't see it if you just do it for a small number of people, but if you scale it up, you'll see the effect. So that's the example of the sort of thing that RCTs won't necessarily pick up, especially if they're fairly small. Another big problem of RCTs is the problem of heterogeneity, and Eva Vervolt's written quite a lot about this. So this graph here is something that she's produced as a result of a meta-analysis of RCT results in development studies. These are the different sort of cause areas that they've been conducted in, and each point here or line represents a different study in a different location and context and so on. The point here is heterogeneity means variation, and the point is that the results obtained vary quite a lot. Look at micronutrients, for example. This is a negative half a standard deviation effect up to, what's the highest one? Over 1 plus 1 standard deviation effect. That's a very large range of effect sizes. So which is the correct? What's the answer? The answer is that we really shouldn't expect consistency here, because what a randomized controlled trial does is it should give you an unbiased estimate of the population parameter, but only in the exact precise context in which you did the study. So, that particular country with its particular climate and social situation and economic state of affairs and so on and so on and so on. If you start changing these things, if you do it in a location where there are cultural differences, or where they grow a different agricultural product, or where the transportation system's very different, or they have a different political system, then you would expect the results to be different. And the trouble is you can't really tell why the results are different. Like, you can expect, okay, well, the context is different, but what specifically about the context resulted in the difference? RCTs won't tell you that. And that leads to the second, generally won't tell you that. And that leads to the next thing, which is that RCTs are kind of hard to interpret. Well, in a sense, they're really easy to interpret, which also makes them hard to interpret. So what this exact is not really important, but the point is this is generally the result you get from a randomized controlled trial. You get sort of two numbers or two proportions, and you compare them from the treatment to the control group. Is it bigger or smaller? And you look at the difference, and you see whether that's statistically significant. Okay, but let's suppose it is statistically significant. Well, yay, we found a difference. Why was there a difference? Well, the RCT won't tell you why there was a difference, it just tells you that there is a difference. And of course you say, well, yes, but I've got all these reasons that I can give as to why my program worked. But the RCT doesn't really test those reasons or the story that you've given, it just tells you this is the effect. Similarly, if you don't find an effect, if you find no significant difference, you can't tell why you didn't find an effect. Say you do an RCT in one context, you find an effect, and then you do it again in a different context, you don't find an effect. You can't tell, at least from the RCT results, why you got different results, because it just doesn't provide that information. So that's not to That's not to bash on RCTs, it's just to emphasize that these are some of the limitations that authors like these have highlighted, and some of the reasons why that they argue that RCTs can be sort of overhyped, or have been, arguably. Okay, so how much more? Okay, I just wanted to talk a bit about structural modelling. Okay, so we've talked about two different approaches so far. Basically, a sort of more standard regression analysis where you have your dependent variable, the thing you're trying to explain, you introduce a whole bunch of variables to control for different sources of variation, and you try to estimate the relationships between them. That's a sort of standard approach. Now, then we talked about program evaluation, which is, the focus was on randomized controlled trials, where you intervene in a system and try to use that randomization to observe a difference. There's a third approach. I mean, arguably it's more similar to the first one, but I'm going to discuss it as a third approach just for classification purposes, which is called structural modelling. It's a bit different to the previous two, because the idea of structural modelling is that you try to make very explicit assumptions about the causal processes, what's actually going on that generates your results in your system. So in economics, this generally means that you define a utility function. So you say, so I'm taking households in rural Kenya, say, and I'm going to say that they have a utility function over their consumption of goods, which can include, their food and clothing and whatever else. And then I define some sort of production function. So maybe in this case, it's the income that they get from working plus the income that they can get from producing food for their own consumption or whatever else, again, depending on the situation. I define some sort of time span. So maybe just indefinitely, maybe for a length of a generation, however long, and whatever information we think they have available. I define the institutional setup, so like how many competing firms are there, are the markets efficient or not, is there government intervention, that sort of thing, what are the transaction costs. And basically, given all of that setup, I try to maximize the utility of my agents in the system, subject to the constraints, the production functions and resource constraints, over the time span that we're talking about. And so, that involves a lot of fancy maths, and the point is you use that to derive an equation to estimate. So, and then you use the data to estimate structural parameters of your equation. So how is this different to what we've done before, you might be wondering? The main reason it's different is because we start with a detailed theory about how people behave and what constraints they're under. Rather than just saying, well, I think education and income are related to each other, let's see what the relationship is, I actually specify, well, I think people choose how much education to get based on this and this, and therefore I think I derive some equations and figure out what specifically the relationship between education and income should be, and then I estimate the parameters in that model. So the big advantage of structural modelling is that it tells you how the system works, or it's a way of testing your model of how the system works in specific details. But it requires a lot of assumptions about the functional forms, the particular forms of the equation that you're using. And unfortunately, because of that, it means that you often get lots of parameters. This is just an example. I can't even remember where I pulled this from. But you get these big tables of parameters that they need to estimate in their models. So variables these are variables actually, but they have their associated parameters of the relationships between them, right? And it's hard to identify a lot of these models. Like, it's hard to get enough data to make estimates about all of these different parameters here. And of course, if someone doesn't like your model, they just say, oh, well, look at this assumption you made about their utility function, or look at this assumption you made about the institutional setup, and they can find something to disagree with. So these are very good in terms of actually saying how the thing works, or you make assumptions about how the system works and then test them on the data, and you can see how good your assumptions turn out. But of course, there are so many assumptions you have to make and so many different parts to it, then there's always room for dispute about how reasonable was this aspect or that aspect, or why it did or didn't work. Okay, so this is a useful summary here of what we talked about today. This is a sort of slightly unusual notation perhaps, but I think it emphasizes, well, it's helpful for me anyway, so maybe it will be helpful for you. So here we've got our dependent variable, the thing you want to explain, like differences in income, for example. Here are our independent variables, the things that we think do the explaining, like differences in education or health status or something like that. And we're trying to estimate this. That's beta 0, that's slightly confusing. But anyway, we want to estimate this, which is just a relationship between x and y, right? But there's problems with that. There are these variables here, which are the control variables that we have to add. If we don't put all the right ones in, that leads to emitted variable bias, which we talked about before. If we have, these are our errors here, remember that's our sort of unaccounted for variation. If these are correlated with these, then that leads to endogeneity, which, as we said before, leads to biased estimates. So this correlated with this is a problem. Putting the wrong W's here can be a problem. And furthermore, there's the external validity or heterogeneity problem. this here, this sort of strange thing here, is basically saying that you can have situations where the relationship between x and y depends on some further variables. Like this is the institutional context thing. The relationship between education and income might depend on the country you're looking at. And so if there is a dependency like this, then the estimate that you get depends on where you do the study or what data you're using. So there's not like one answer, there's lots of answers. So this is just a summary form putting all those different pieces together in terms of the regression equation. So all of these are reasons why you can sort of get the wrong answer or have difficulties with estimates. Okay, I didn't get to go through instrumental variables. Maybe we'll cover that a little bit later, so just ignore that if you see it on the sheet. But these are some books that I found useful in preparing these slides. So I know we've gone through a fair amount, but we're only about halfway through, which is good because now it's your turn to sort of try to digest and apply some of the stuff I've been talking about. So I have some worksheets here. There should actually be enough for pretty much everyone to get one. So let me just, before I hand them out, actually Nelson, do you have a moment? You can help me hand these sheets out? Good. So